Every weekday morning for more than half a century, a government ferry left Orient Point at the very tip of Long Island's North Fork and crossed a mile and a half of some of the most treacherous tidal currents on the East Coast. The passengers were scientists, veterinarians, animal handlers, maintenance workers, about 300 of them at peak, heading to jobs they mostly could not discuss. When they arrived on the island, they changed out of their civilian clothes and into laboratory-issued garments. When they left at the end of the day, they stripped again, showered for a mandatory 5 minutes, blew their noses into tissues, cleared their throats and expectorated to purge any inhaled particles, and soaked their eyeglasses in a decontamination solution before they were allowed to put their own clothes back on. They could not carry open food containers onto the ferry home. Some were forbidden from visiting farms, petting zoos, or livestock auctions for days after a shift. They commuted, in other words, like people going to work at an office, except the office was an 840-acre island housing some of the most lethal animal pathogens on the planet. And if a single one of those pathogens reached the mainland aboard a stray tick, a wind-blown droplet, or an unwashed hand, it could have triggered an agricultural catastrophe worth tens of billions of dollars. That was Plum Island. For 70 years, the United States government ran one of the most restricted research facilities in the country on a small, sandy, scrub-covered island that most Americans had never heard of, and the ones who had heard of it usually knew it from conspiracy theories. The island appears in The Silence of the Lambs. Hannibal Lecter is offered a week's furlough there in exchange for his cooperation. A bloated, hairless carcass that washed up on a nearby beach in 2008 was instantly blamed on whatever dark science was being conducted behind its fences. The best-selling book about the place is called Lab 257, and its subtitle uses the word secret and disturbing before it even gets to government. Plum Island became the kind of American institution whose actual mission, protecting the nation's food supply from foreign animal diseases, was perpetually overshadowed by rumors about what else might be happening behind the chain link and the no trespassing signs. And here is the thing that makes this story worth telling. The rumors were not entirely wrong. The island sits in the waters between the North Fork of Long Island and the Connecticut shoreline, a low, windswept strip of land roughly 3 miles long and a mile wide. The Pequot nation called it Manitouwand. Europeans first charted it around 1614, when Adrian Block, a Dutch navigator, sailed through and mapped the area. The Dutch called it Plum Island, after the wild beach plums that grew thick along its shores. Those plums still grow there. In 1659, the island was sold. Samuel Willis III, the son of the governor of Connecticut, purchased it from Wyandanch, a Montauk chief, for a coat, a barrel of biscuits, and 100 fishhooks. Those were the actual terms of the transaction, and the island would pass through the hands of more than 20 families over the next 2.5 centuries, most of them farming, raising livestock, and enduring the hard isolation that comes with living on a piece of land reachable only by boat across water that wanted to kill you. The island had one brush with military history long before Fort Terry. On August 11, 1775, American General David Worcester dispatched 120 soldiers in an amphibious assault on the island where British forces were encamped. The soldiers were fired upon immediately. They returned a single volley and retreated to Long Island. No casualties were recorded, but the skirmish is believed to represent one of the first amphibious assaults conducted by an American army. The Plum Gut Channel, the mile-wide passage between Orient Point and Plum Island, has some of the strongest tidal currents in the northeastern United States. Sailors feared it. Merchants needed it. It was one of the main entrances to Long Island Sound, and the shipping lanes it served carried the commerce of New York and New England. Congress recognized this in 1826 and appropriated $4,000 for a lighthouse. The following year, a 35-foot octagonal stone tower went up on 3 acres at the island's western tip, purchased from a man named Richard Jerome for $90. 10 whale oil lamps with reflectors guided ships through the gut. The keepers were a breed apart, isolated for months at the mercy of weather and supply boats, responsible for a flame that the regional economy literally depended on. By the late 1860s, the original tower was falling apart, and a new 55-foot granite lighthouse was constructed in 1869, a handsome two-story dwelling with a white cast-iron tower capped by a black lantern room. Its keeper, William Wetmore, was apparently such a skilled fisherman that John Jacob Astor, the same John Jacob Astor who would later die on the Titanic, once visited Plum Island specifically to be outfitted with bait and lines by Wetmore. In the late 1800s, wealthy New Yorkers discovered the island's remoteness could be a selling point. Rustic fish camps sprang up, attracting men who wanted to escape the noise and velocity of Gilded Age Manhattan for a few days of solitude and surf casting. It was, for a brief window, a place people went to find peace. That window closed in 1897. The Spanish-American War exposed a problem the United States government had been worrying about for years. The nation's coastal defenses were dangerously obsolete. Steel warships and long-range naval artillery had made the old brick forts useless, and Congress authorized a massive new system of fortifications under what was known as the Endicott Program. The strategic geography of eastern Long Island Sound made it an obvious priority. Enemy ships heading for New York or New London would have to pass through, and the cluster of islands at the Sound's eastern mouth offered perfect positions for artillery batteries. Plum Island was one of them. In 1897, the government began purchasing land on the island, and by 1899, it had acquired the entire 840 acres for approximately $90,000. Fort Terry, named for Major General Alfred Terry, a Civil War commander, rose from the scrub grass and boulder-strewn bluffs. Concrete gun batteries were dug into the earth, angled to rake approaching ships with crossfire. Ammunition depots, barracks, searchlight stations, and submarine mine control buildings followed. A miniature gauge railroad was built with its own locomotive and cars to haul ammunition and supplies across the island's 3 miles of terrain. At its peak, the fort comprised nearly 24 buildings and fortifications. But Fort Terry had a peculiar career. When the Spanish-American War erupted less than a year into construction, authorities purchased artillery from Britain, the former enemy, to get the batteries operational fast enough to defend New York from potential naval attack. The war ended before the guns were tested in combat. The fort was manned through the early 20th century. The 133rd Company of the Coast Artillery Corps was organized there in 1907, and its large-caliber guns commanded the shipping lanes with an authority that was mostly theoretical. During World War I, many of those guns were pulled from their emplacements and shipped to France for repurposing on the Western Front. The fort never fired a shot in anger. It saw renewed activity during World War II as a training facility, supply depot, and lookout for German U-boats trolling the waters off the North American coast. Soldiers stationed on the island's eastern bluffs scanned the Atlantic through binoculars, watching for periscopes in the same currents that had troubled mariners for centuries. Radar and coastal surveillance equipment was installed, the most modern technology the island had ever seen, layered onto a fort built to fight the previous century's wars. But by 1948, the coastal artillery mission had been rendered obsolete by aircraft and guided missiles, and the fort was declared surplus for the final time. The guns were scrapped, the barracks emptied, the miniature railroad sat on its narrow tracks with nowhere to go. The Army walked away. The island sat empty for 4 years, just long enough for a new kind of fear to fill the vacuum. By the early 1950s, the Cold War had rewritten the rules of American national security. The Soviet Union had the atomic bomb. China had fallen to communism. And within the military and intelligence communities, a growing anxiety took hold about a weapon that was, in some ways, more terrifying than nuclear warheads: biological warfare aimed at the food supply. If the Soviets could introduce foot and mouth disease, rinderpest, or African swine fever into American livestock herds, the economic damage would be staggering. Millions of animals slaughtered, export markets destroyed, food prices spiking, and public confidence shattered. And the attack might not even be traceable. The United States did not simply want to defend against this threat. It wanted to build the same capability for itself. On April 15, 1952, Plum Island was reactivated and assigned to the Army Chemical Corps. The mission statement, later recovered from declassified records by the investigative reporter John McDonald of Newsday in 1993, was blunt: to establish and pursue a program of research and development of certain anti-animal biological warfare agents. The plan was to develop pathogens that could cripple the Soviet agricultural economy, diseases that would kill horses, cattle, and swine. Building 257, the old torpedo storehouse and cable tanks building that had been constructed around 1911 for conventional munitions storage, was remodeled into a biological warfare laboratory. Fort Terry's abandoned infrastructure was repurposed around a new and far more dangerous mission. And then there was the matter of personnel. When the Army Chemical Corps began setting up its operation on Plum Island, it needed expertise in weaponizing animal diseases. That expertise existed, but the most qualified expert in the world happened to be a former Nazi. His name was Erich Traub. Before the war, Traub had studied virology at the Rockefeller Institute in Princeton, New Jersey, on a fellowship, an American-educated scientist who spoke fluent English and understood American laboratory culture. He returned to Germany on the eve of war and became lab chief of Insel Reims, a crescent-shaped island in the Baltic Sea that served as the secret Nazi biological warfare laboratory. Working under Heinrich Himmler, Traub developed methods to weaponize foot and mouth disease and rinderpest for use against Soviet livestock. He personally traveled to Turkey to collect virus strains. He experimented with aerial dispersal of pathogens. His colleagues, according to declassified records, conducted field tests dropping live infected beetles from planes. After the war, Traub continued his research at Insel Reims under Soviet supervision. In 1948, the British evacuated him. In 1949, under Operation Paperclip, the secret program that brought more than 1,600 former Nazi scientists to the United States, including Werner von Braun, Traub was given American citizenship. He was stationed at the Naval Medical Research Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, and within months was meeting with scientists from Fort Detrick, the Army's biological warfare headquarters. Traub provided detailed briefings on the operations at Insel Reims, both under the Nazis and the Russians. He described the exact diseases, the exact methods, the exact infrastructure of a biological warfare island. The parallels were obvious to everyone in the room. Both Insel Reims and Plum Island were islands. Both were government facilities. Both studied animal diseases that could devastate agricultural economies. The man who had run one was now helping design the other. According to Michael Christopher Carroll's 2004 book Lab 257, a source who worked on Plum Island in the 1950s recalled that animal handlers and a scientist released ticks outdoors on the island. They called him the Nazi scientist, the source said. When they came in 1951, they were inoculating these ticks. Traub returned to Germany in 1953, but the program he helped shape was already in motion. On July 1, 1954, the mission of Plum Island officially changed. The Army transferred the facility to the United States Department of Agriculture, and it became the Plum Island Animal Disease Center, the PIADC. The stated purpose was now defensive, studying foreign animal diseases to protect American farmers and ranchers. Construction began on a new laboratory, Building 101, and on September 26, 1956, the $7.7 million facility was dedicated. Before the building opened, the surrounding area was sprayed with chemicals to deter any insect or animal life from approaching. The name Building 101 struck some observers as darkly ironic. George Orwell's 1984, published just 7 years earlier, featured Room 101 as the place where prisoners were subjected to their worst nightmares. Whether the numbering was coincidental or not, the building's purpose was formidable. It would house research on more than 40 foreign animal diseases, including the only live samples of foot and mouth disease virus permitted on American soil. Federal law prohibited the virus from being studied anywhere on the mainland. Plum Island's isolation, the same mile-and-a-half of violent tidal current that had always defined the place, was now the containment strategy for one of the most contagious pathogens known to veterinary science. The transition from military to civilian control was supposed to mark a clean break from offensive weapons to defensive research, from war to agriculture, from secrecy to science. But here is a fact that the government denied for decades, and that was not confirmed until Newsday's John McDonald unearthed now declassified Army records in a 1993 investigation. The biological weapons research did not stop when the USDA took over in 1954. It continued for another 15 years, running in parallel with the civilian disease prevention mission, until President Richard Nixon formally ended the United States offensive bioweapons program in 1969. For 15 years, Plum Island was simultaneously a place that studied animal diseases to protect America and a place that developed animal diseases to attack the Soviet Union. The same labs, the same island, the same ferry. At its operational peak, the Plum Island Animal Disease Center employed roughly 360 people, about half of whom worked on the island itself and the rest in support roles on the mainland. The facility had its own fire department, its own power plant, its own water treatment system, and its own security force. It ran approximately 30,000 diagnostic tests per year. It was, by the accounts of the scientists who worked there, a genuinely important institution. The research conducted on Plum Island helped develop vaccines and diagnostic tools that prevented catastrophic outbreaks in developing nations and kept foreign animal diseases from entering the American food supply. The importance of this mission was not abstract. In 2001, an outbreak of foot and mouth disease in the United Kingdom lasted nearly a year, resulted in the slaughter of more than 6 million animals, and cost the British economy an estimated £8 billion. That catastrophe unfolded on an island nation with robust veterinary infrastructure and rapid response capability. The American livestock industry was vastly larger, vastly more interconnected, and, if the disease ever reached the mainland, vastly more vulnerable. Plum Island's research was the front line against that scenario. Scientists there developed vaccines, refined diagnostic tests, and trained veterinarians to recognize diseases they would never encounter in normal practice, so they could respond within hours if something appeared on American soil. But the infrastructure was aging, and the safety record was not clean. In 1978, foot and mouth disease escaped from Building 101 into the outdoor cattle holding pens on the island. Construction work had been underway, and the virus found its way to animals that had not yet been experimentally inoculated. Authorities declared an outbreak and killed every animal on the island: 94 cattle, 87 pigs, 66 lambs, 28 rabbits, 27 chickens, 13 goats, 6 horses, 2 ducks, and colonies of mice and guinea pigs. Inspectors subsequently determined that certain wastewater streams had been bypassing full sterilization, that monitoring systems were not consistently calibrated, and that treatment records were incomplete. The entire facility was doused with decontamination chemicals. Every employee had to bag their clothes, shower without towels, and leave in clean coveralls. The virus never reached the mainland. The water barrier held. But the incident prompted the construction of new indoor biocontainment buildings to house all research animals. Even with those upgrades, 2 more outbreaks occurred within 5 years, though both were contained within the new biocontainment units. Then came Hurricane Bob. On August 19, 1991, the hurricane struck the northeastern coast with sustained winds that devastated Long Island's North Fork. On Plum Island, the storm knocked out the primary power supply. That alone was not supposed to be catastrophic. The facility had an underground emergency backup generator. But according to Carroll's Lab 257, that backup had been inoperative for some time, and the facility had been relying on exposed overhead power lines meant as a secondary backup. The hurricane destroyed those lines. The island went dark. Without electricity, nothing in the lab worked. The air filtration systems that maintained negative pressure in the biocontainment areas shut down. The sewage holding tanks could not pump. Contaminated waste, including the waste of dozens of cattle infected with live viruses, began leaking across the floors. The freezers containing hundreds of disease cultures started warming, and samples began thawing and seeping. Only 2 workers were available to address the contaminated sewage, and they had boots and gloves, but no respiratory safety equipment. The crisis was eventually resolved without a confirmed pathogen release to the mainland, but the near miss illustrated a reality that critics had been warning about for years. The facility was dangerously outdated, underfunded, and operating on borrowed time. A modernization program had been proposed back in 1977 to update both Building 101 and Building 257, but it was canceled in 1979 because of construction contract irregularities. The facilities remained essentially unchanged until a new modernization effort began in 1990, which renovated 2/3 of Building 101's laboratory space and finally decommissioned the aging Building 257, consolidating all operations into the newer structure. The problems did not stop. In the summer of 2004, foot and mouth disease was released twice within the biocontainment areas of Building 101. Officials characterized the incidents as operational issues and made no public statement. It was only after Senator Hillary Clinton and Representative Timothy Bishop, whose district included eastern Long Island, demanded answers that the details came out. And in 2008, the Bush administration acknowledged, in a letter to the House Energy and Commerce Committee, that there had been additional in-laboratory incidents, contamination events inside the facility, going back to 1954. The full scope of those incidents had never been publicly disclosed. By then, the problems had metastasized into something the government could not contain: public suspicion. Plum Island sits approximately 10 miles from Old Lyme, Connecticut. In 1975, children in that town began reporting unusual skin rashes, chronic fatigue, and swollen knees, symptoms that would eventually be traced to a tick-borne bacterial infection caused by the spirochete Borrelia burgdorferi. The condition was named Lyme disease in 1981. It now afflicts more than 30,000 reported cases per year in the United States, and some estimates place the actual number far higher. The proximity was impossible to ignore, and a theory took hold: that Plum Island's tick experiments had created or released the pathogen responsible for Lyme disease. Carroll's Lab 257 laid out the circumstantial case. Researchers on the island had studied ticks, the facility had a documented history of containment failures, and the closest mainland point was the exact town where the disease first appeared. He speculated that migrating birds may have carried infected ticks from the island across Long Island Sound to the Connecticut shore. The government's response did not help. The Department of Homeland Security's official statement was carefully narrow. PIADC scientists do not research and have not researched Lyme disease. This was technically accurate, but it sidestepped the question of whether researchers had experimented with ticks as disease vectors, which they demonstrably had. In 2019, Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey successfully passed an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill directing the Pentagon to investigate whether the Department of Defense had experimented with weaponized ticks between 1950 and 1975. Chris Newby's book, Bitten, published the same year, included interviews with Dr. Willy Burgdorfer, the entomologist who had identified the Lyme bacterium, revealing his background as a bioweapons specialist. The evidence for a Plum Island origin of Lyme disease, however, is thin. Borrelia burgdorferi was found in a 5,300-year-old mummy discovered in the Alps, meaning the bacterium had been circulating in nature for thousands of years before Plum Island existed. Researchers have insisted that neither the black-legged tick nor the Lyme bacterium was ever present on the island. The most compelling counter to the conspiracy theory is also the simplest. The bacterium did not need to be engineered or released. It was already in the environment. The 1975 cluster in Old Lyme was the moment of identification, not the moment of creation. But Plum Island's culture of secrecy made the denial almost impossible to credit. When an institution spends decades refusing to answer questions, classifying records, and hiding behind fences and ferry schedules, the public fills the silence with its own explanations. The Lyme disease theory was, in a sense, the logical product of the island's own opacity. The secrecy that was supposed to protect national security had become its own kind of vulnerability. The attacks of September 11, 2001 transformed Plum Island's institutional identity. In 2003, the Department of Homeland Security assumed ownership of the island and all its facilities from the USDA. The timing was not coincidental. The anthrax letter attacks of 2001 had made bioterrorism a first-tier national security concern, and Plum Island's mission was reframed around that threat. But the facility was showing its age. In 2005, DHS warned that the lab was in danger of becoming outdated and announced plans to build a replacement. The location chosen was Manhattan, Kansas, on the campus of Kansas State University in the heart of the nation's cattle country, within the Kansas City Animal Health Corridor. Critics were incredulous. The entire logic of Plum Island had been geographic isolation. If a pathogen escaped, the water would stop it. Now the government proposed moving foot and mouth disease virus, a pathogen so contagious that a single infected animal could devastate an entire region's herds, to a facility surrounded by the densest concentration of cattle in the country, in a state with a documented history of large, destructive tornadoes. Studies commissioned during the debate concluded that the probability of an accidental release was, depending on the scenario, none to low, except in the event of an overpressure fire involving an explosion in an enclosed area, which nobody found particularly reassuring. A National Research Council report in 2010 questioned the decision, and the estimated cost ballooned from $451 million to over $1.25 billion, as the facility's design was reinforced to compensate for the absence of a natural water barrier. The National Bio and Agro Defense Facility, NBAF, finally opened in June 2023, funded by a combination of $938 million in federal appropriations, $307 million from the state of Kansas, and $5 million from the city of Manhattan. Meanwhile, Congress had passed a law in 2008 ordering the General Services Administration to auction Plum Island to the highest bidder, with the proceeds earmarked for the Kansas replacement. There was also a question nobody in Congress seemed eager to answer. What exactly was in the ground? Until recent decades, all waste generated by the Plum Island Animal Disease Center and by the Army's biological warfare program before it stayed on the island. No waste was removed. Some of it was incinerated. Much of it was buried. Animal remains, contaminated equipment, decontamination chemicals, and the residue of 7 decades of pathogen research were interred somewhere beneath the sand and scrub. Any sale would presumably require an environmental assessment, and whatever that assessment revealed would become the buyer's problem. The prospect of the island going to a private developer galvanized an opposition that cut across every political and ideological line on the eastern seaboard. Environmentalists pointed to the island's extraordinary biodiversity, over 229 bird species, including endangered piping plovers and roseate terns, plus New York's largest seal haul-out. Historians cited Fort Terry and the 1869 lighthouse. The town of Southold, which technically includes Plum Island within its boundaries, passed zoning laws designed to limit development if a private buyer took possession. In 2015, environmental groups threatened to sue on the grounds that a sale would harm endangered species. Senators from New York and Connecticut argued that the original rationale for selling the island, funding the Kansas facility, was no longer valid, since the housing market decline of 2008 had depressed the projected auction price far below what Congress had anticipated. The Preserve Plum Island Coalition, an alliance of 116 organizations, mounted a sustained campaign to block the sale. It worked. A series of congressional actions delayed the auction year after year, and on December 21, 2020, a provision tucked into a $2.3 trillion spending bill permanently repealed the 2008 sale mandate. Senator Chuck Schumer called it a top priority of the negotiations. It would have been a grave mistake, he said, to sell and develop Plum Island's 840 acres of habitat. On a summer morning in July 2008, 5 years after DHS took over the island, 12 years before Congress blocked the sale, a beachgoer named Jenna Hewitt was looking for a spot to play ball games on Ditch Plains Beach in Montauk, about 50 miles from Plum Island, when she and her friends noticed people clustered around something on the sand. The creature was dead, bloated, and hairless, with what appeared to be a beak-like snout, clawed limbs, and a body that did not resemble any animal anyone present could identify. Hewitt's photograph ran in the Independent, a local East Hampton newspaper, under the headline, "The Hound of Bonnickville." The Internet took it from there. The Montauk Monster, as the creature was immediately dubbed, became a viral sensation. Theories proliferated. It was a mutant from Plum Island, an alien, a government experiment gone wrong. The body reportedly disappeared before it could be definitively examined. Experts who studied the photograph eventually concluded it was almost certainly a raccoon, decomposed and bloated beyond recognition by its time in the water. The missing upper teeth, the exposed jaw giving the illusion of a beak, the swollen limbs. But it did not matter. By the time the explanation arrived, Plum Island had already absorbed the Montauk Monster into its mythology, the way certain places absorb every strange thing that happens within 100 miles of them. Ditch Plains sat squarely between Camp Hero in Montauk, already the subject of its own government experiment rumors, and Plum Island itself. 2 years later, when the Associated Press reported that a human body with very long fingers had washed up on Plum Island's own shore, the speculation started again. The body was never identified. These episodes reveal something about Plum Island that the official histories tend to miss. The island's power was never just in what it contained, the viruses, the pathogens, the classified research. Its power was in what it represented, a place that operated beyond public view, answering questions nobody outside was allowed to ask, and generating a silence that the American imagination could not resist filling. Every unexplained carcass, every unexplained illness, every unexplained fact in the region accreted to the island's reputation, until Plum Island became less a physical place than a symbol of government secrecy, of risk accepted on behalf of citizens who did not consent to it, of the line between protection and danger. Scientific research at Plum Island ended in September 2025. The last experiments were completed, the last data sets were archived, and the long process of decommissioning and decontaminating the biocontainment facilities began in accordance with federal select agent and environmental regulations. The work of dismantling the labs, neutralizing pathogens, treating contaminated materials, scrubbing surfaces that had held live foot and mouth disease virus for 7 decades is expected to take years. No animals or equipment will be transferred to Kansas. The NBAF was built and stocked independently. The island's future remains undetermined. Representative Nick LaLota of New York introduced the Plum Island National Monument Act, which passed out of the House Natural Resources Committee in late 2024. A companion bill in the Senate would permanently protect the island from development. Federal officials have discussed transferring stewardship to Suffolk County. The Preserve Plum Island Coalition envisions nature trails, educational exhibits, and large preserved wildlife areas. If no public entity takes ownership, the island could, under GSA rules, ultimately be offered for private sale after all, the very outcome that the coalition spent a decade fighting to prevent. For now, the island belongs to nobody and everybody. The Army's concrete gun batteries, built to defend against Spanish warships that never came, still stand on the eastern bluffs, overgrown with scrub. The narrow roads that once carried the miniature railroad's ammunition cars are cracked and weedy. Rusted tracks run through the grass. Fort Terry's barracks and storehouses, repurposed for biological warfare, and then for agriculture, and then for homeland security, sit in various states of decay and decontamination. Building 101, the $7.7 million laboratory dedicated in 1956, the building whose name echoed Orwell, the building where foot-and-mouth disease and African swine fever and 40 other pathogens were studied and contained and on occasion escaped, is being scrubbed of its purpose. The 1869 lighthouse still stands at the island's western tip, though it has not served as an active navigation aid since 1978, when the light was automated on a squat metal tower nearby. The Fresnel lens was removed in 1994 and sent to the East End Seaport Museum in Greenport, where it sits on display, a piece of Plum Island that the public can actually see and touch, separated from the island's classified history by a few miles of water and a century of changed purposes. And the wildlife has come back, or perhaps more accurately, it never left. 229 species of birds have been documented on the island. Piping plovers nest on its beaches. Roseate terns breed in its grasses. Seals haul out on the rocky shoreline where soldiers once scanned the horizon for German submarines. New York's largest colony of them, dozens of gray and harbor seals piled on boulders, staring at the water with the placid indifference of animals who have no idea they are lying on one of the most contested pieces of real estate in the northeastern United States. The ferry from Orient Point has not carried scientists to work in a long time. The dock is quiet. The decontamination showers are dry. The air filtration systems that once maintained negative pressure inside the biocontainment labs, pulling air in so that nothing could drift out, have been shut down. For the first time in 70 years, the air on Plum Island moves wherever it wants to go. The beach plums still grow along the shore, the same ones the Dutch noticed in 1640, the same ones that gave the island the only name most people will ever know it by. A coat, a barrel of biscuits, and 100 fishhooks bought this place once. $1.25 billion built its replacement. And the island itself, 840 acres of sand and rock and scrub and secrets, guarded for decades by fences and ferries and federal law, waits in the Sound for someone to decide what it is now.